You got the clicker?
Yeah. There's water. Okay. Hello. I'm Sasha, Jay. There is a lot of EPSS going on at this conference. This talk is an introduction. So for those who know nothing about EPSS and would like to learn more, this is for you. There is another workshop tomorrow that Jay will run that takes a deeper dive into EPSS. So including more of the data that we have, performance of the model, and lots of other details. There's also a sort of impromptu SIG meeting tomorrow for those who are interested, as well as a quick update. Sort of all of the first SIGs will have an update tomorrow, so we're also talking a little bit about that. So anyway, this is the introductory talk. If you already know EPSS, you will have seen this before. And so as I said, the deeper dive is tomorrow. So thank you for coming. Thank you to all the people who have come from very far away. It's very conscientious of you, so thank you for that. And if you have any questions, feel free to talk to us after. Today or tomorrow, we'll be around for a couple of days. Okay. What the hell? Okay, so this is us. Thank you. So let me start with a problem. So I imagine you all know this space very well. The spirit of this effort is about vulnerability management, vulnerability prioritization. So you may well be familiar with CVSS, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. EPSS really addresses the problem of we have all these vulnerabilities. Which ones do we worry about first? Which ones do we patch? Which ones do we remediate first? So what seems to be appearing over the years from analysis is that a very small percentage of all vulnerabilities are being exploited. So something on the order of 2 to 5%. Different papers provide different estimates. We'll show you some of ours, but the point is we have this very small number amongst over 200,000 vulnerabilities. Which ones do we worry about? Now, as we mentioned, I have some experience with CVSS, and at the beginning, the hope was that this really provides and captures useful information about vulnerabilities. So these characteristics of the vulnerabilities that people can use, network defenders can use to patch their system. So the thought was, so initially it was trying to be a risk score, a risk framework, but the base score, for better or worse, sort of took off, and that has turned into obviously an effort. And the score is very intuitive, right? We can all recognize it 0 to 10. And we have some notion of how severe. We kind of think that the more severe it is, the more we patch. The trouble is that as we've learned, severity is not correlated in any significant way with exploitation. So that's an important realization right there. And so what that means is that if you are developing a prioritization management sort of practice of patching 9 pluses or 8 pluses, that's great. You will have a lot of vulnerabilities that you end up patching. Only a very small percentage of those will be exploited. And the problem gets even worse if you're patching 7 pluses, right? So you have this mountain of vulnerabilities to patch. Again, only a very small portion. So what we tried to do was to say, hey, is there a better way of doing this? And based on some of the work that Jay was doing with Kenneth Security back in the day, they were able to collect actual exploit data, add that as a model, seed it with other features of the vulnerabilities, and create a prediction model. Well, that's a great capability. That's an amazing thing to be able to do that we haven't had before. So to be clear, the capability of being able to predict which vulnerabilities will be exploited, I think, is an amazing thing. And so what we really wanted to do was to turn that into an effort, into a completely data-driven way, right? So if we know with CVSS, it's based on scores, and there's some confusion about what it really does, expert-based. And so what we really wanted to do was to provide some empirical, data-driven way of understanding the threat of these vulnerabilities. Whoops. So what we have now, so the SIG is a couple years old now, hosted under FIRST, just like CVSS is. And again, it provides predictions from, 0% to 100% or 0 to 1 of the probability that any given vulnerability will be exploited specifically in the next 30 days. The data are there, the scores are there online, free for anyone to go and download now. So if you go to the website, you can either use the API or you can use a CSV file that will provide you all 200,000 plus vulnerabilities, scores for each of those vulnerabilities. Now, none of this would be possible, and so EPSS is nothing without the exploitation data. Those exploitation data come from these partners. So if any of you are members of these organizations, thank you very much. This is amazing, and it really is starting to build momentum, build a greater community. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So what we have are a couple things. So a mailing list, which for which we send out notices about updates. Also, as part of the SIG, a Slack. We have something close to 250 members of researchers, security vendors, practitioners, government-affiliated people from around the world. And so this is growing every day. When we first had these slides, it was 150, then it was 180, then it was 200, now up to 240. In addition, we have a bunch of papers. So for those who are skeptical or just curious, want to learn more about how the model actually works, what the details are, the performance of the models, these papers are available for you all to download and read. So what can we do with EPSS? So one of the things we can do, so as we know, CVSS, what can we do with EPSS? CVSS speaks about the severity. So if we believe that this is a good reflection, or at least directionally appropriate reflection of the severity of a vulnerability, EPSS will provide a notion of the likelihood. So one of the things you can do is plot this on a scatter plot like this. And now you can take a look at this mapping. You can say, okay, how do I prioritize my vulnerabilities? The high highs are a clear place to start. The low lows are a clear place to end, to deprioritize. And how you get from one corner to the other is really up to you. If you believe that EPSS is the way to go, that threat, that the probability of exploitation is really the most important thing for you, then you would go sort of horizontally and fix all of the vulnerabilities above a certain EPSS score, and that's fine. If you believe that, look, well, there is, even though the probability of exploitation might be kind of low, if exploited would severely impact my organization, then you might provide a strategy of kind of going down a little bit and then over, but it's up to you. But again, this kind of capability has never existed before, and I think this is pretty useful. S-bombs have taken over as a thing to talk about, which is pretty useful. So a notion of, for all of the software applications, the modern commercial applications or even the in-house development applications, let's get an understanding of all the dependencies and all the libraries that these packages use and reference, et cetera, et cetera. So another thing you can do is take that and plot it on a scatter plot like this. It's the same one. There's no coincidence that these graphs look the same. But this could be useful for you, for those of you who are in this space, in this S-bomb space, of trying to either track the changes, maybe the improvements of risk, sort of risk, of your applications over time, or compare sort of the risk between two different applications to create these kinds of slides. They either just visually inspect them, or maybe for future development, somebody could take and create, I don't know, some kind of, I don't want to call it a risk score based on all of this, but some notion of let's capture all of the vulnerabilities from one S-bomb, compare that with another. That could be a useful thing. One of the other really interesting things that being part of this that is really all due to Jay and his amazing data science skills is us being able to acquire information about actual vulnerabilities that are being exploited, which again is something I had never seen, based on my experience, and I had never seen published by anyone else for that matter. So now we're starting to get a good sense of sort of fundamental research and starting to answer these fundamental questions about what kinds of vulnerabilities are being exploited. What is the age of vulnerabilities? What is the frequency? What is the tempo? What is the cadence of these vulnerabilities that are being exploited? Is there a burstiness to it? Is there a fragmentation of these? Well, now we can start to get at some of that. So here, this gives you a sense. So over the past 20 or so, So of all of the vulnerabilities that we see exploited, what is the age of them? Well, here's an interesting histogram of that, and I'll talk more about that. We're also seeing, of course, for many of you who are in the space, an increase in the rate of disclosure of known vulnerabilities. Well, we can divide one of these graphs by the other and get a sense of the overall probability of exploitation. So we talk about a small percentage, 5% of vulnerabilities are being exploited. This is how we're arriving at that number. And again, this is pretty important, I think. Another thing we can do is answer an age-old question about whether or not vulnerabilities are being exploited more over time or less over time. So on one hand, we might think the rate of exploitation is increasing over time because more information is known about the vulnerabilities. The exploits themselves are easier, evolving from a proof of concept to point and click, that may provide sort of more attackers with more information, more opportunities to exploit the vulnerability. On the other hand, we might think that vulnerabilities for any given CV is being exploited less over time, right? That today, everyone's interested in this vulnerability because it's exploiting some Windows server, but then tomorrow something new comes along, and so everyone shifts their attention to that vulnerability. And then tomorrow and the next day and the next day, and so there's a decreasing interest in exploiting a given vulnerability. So this topic has been around for a while. I'm actually curious what you all think. All right, so imagine most of you're all experts in this field. Do you have a sense, or at least what is your prior about whether or not vulnerabilities on average are exploited more over time versus less over time? So who thinks they're exploited more over time?
The left
because
one.
they're easier.
The left plot here.
The left one. What did I say? Okay, so sorry. Left. Who thinks more? Okay. You get like a dozen or so. What about exploited less over time? The right plot. Okay, a few more of you. Most of you abstained. I'm not sure what that says about you, but so the answer is, well, a bit of everything. So what we see is for the first 4 years or so, 5 years, there's sort of a monotonic increase. We see a sharp increase within the first year, suggesting that people really do get excited, that once it's disclosed, people really do get excited, want to exploit the vulnerability. So it's exploited more and more and more. There's a bit of a lag after, I don't know, a year and a half, around 2 years, and then increases again up to 4 years. After that, it drops. So there's this hump. Why is there a hump here in exploitation? I have no idea. Right? This is one of the really interesting things about understanding and looking at these data. So there's this hump around 5 years, 6 years, and a sharp decline. After that, it kind of goes up, it kind of goes down, it sort of peters. It's generally uniform over time, and so after about 18 years or so, it falls off the radar. Nobody really seems to care about it. Again, these are all very, very low probabilities to begin with. But on average, here is that pattern. And I think that becomes really interesting. Now, so if you are, you're a network defender, you're probably interested just in those vulnerabilities that are relevant for your network, which is perfectly fine. And so these gives you averages. So I appreciate that this may be kind of less interesting than what I think, but overall pretty telling about what is happening, the trends in these vulnerabilities and exploitation. The other thing that we learn, which is just bananas to me, is that 2/3 of all vulnerabilities that we see being exploited, again, these are attempted exploits, right? Not successful exploits, but attempted exploits. 2/3 of them are over 5 years old, right? So from 2017, 18, and earlier, right? So this is a lot of vulnerabilities that are really old. 1/3 of them are more than 10 years old. Let me say that again. 1/3 of the vulnerabilities that are being exploited, attempted exploits, are more than 10 years old. So what does that mean? Well, the first thing it means is that it's a pretty sorry state of defenses and capabilities and remediation among internet companies, right? Of those with public-facing internet presence. Now, I'll concede that what we can't do from these exploit attempts is separate or independently distinguish background noise. So there might be lots of scanners out there that are trying to do, they're not really malicious in any way, they're sort of benignly scanning the internet. So fine, there may be some of that are looking for these older vulnerabilities. But we don't have reason to believe it's that much. And this is based on, so gray noise, among all of our data sources, gray noise seems to be very good about distinguishing benign from malicious activity. And so it's kind of based a little bit on intuition and expert opinion on that. Again, another opportunity for other people to conduct more research on this. But that aside, so a third of vulnerabilities more than 10 years old. I think that is pretty staggering. One of the other troubles that we face in evolving this SIG, and so again, this is based on conversations with our members over the weeks and weeks and months and years, is how to convey this information, right? Again, CVSS is easy, 0 to 10, everyone kind of gets it, higher score is worse. And the same with the probability, right? If anything, we have the advantage that the score that we present, that we convey, really is a probability. Like it truly is a probability, which means a couple things. One, that, obviously closer to 1, the greater the likelihood of it being exploited. It also means that you can conduct mathematical operations on this probability. And one of the great outcomes of that is that it's scalable. So now we can start to understand the threat, not just of a single vulnerability, but of a server, of a subnet, of an office, or of a global enterprise, right? So we can, we do this by exploiting sort of a common statistical probability, the probability of any one event among a collection of events occurring, right? So we can create a threat score for a given server, which is kind of cool. Anyway, so the first data point that is the output of our model, again, is the probability. But because so many of these, the base rate of exploitation is so low, a lot of the scores will be tiny, minuscule, 0.0004. Well, what do we do with that? How am I supposed to interpret? I've kind of done this for a while. How even am I supposed to understand and provide intuition and internalize what a 0.0004 score means, right? Like, I can't. So what we also do is we present the rank percentile, which is just a rank ordering from worst to, I guess, best. So if you take all of the scores and you order them, then you automatically create that percentile. And we think that becomes a little more intuitive for people to understand that, okay, this is the worst one. Whatever the score is, forget about the score, this is the worst one. This is the 10th worst one. This is the 100th worst one. This one is at the very, very bottom. And what that does, we hope, and happy to take feedback from everyone, is a way of, again, of kind of couching this, because this is really a game of what do I address first? And so while the probabilities are, let's call them global probabilities among all of the vulnerabilities that exist in the world, you can think of the percentile. So what you might do as a user organization, as a network defender, is download the scores, filter out all of the vulnerabilities that don't apply to you in your network, and you're left with a very small subset. And then you can go through and reorder them. Or you would still order them by EPSS score, but then now you get a new rank. And that rank, that percentile ordering, I think, is a better representation for your network. So there's two different ways of providing information that we think are helpful to you as network defenders. And again, happy to discuss this more about trying to understand what is more useful for different organizations. It's not always clear, and so if there's any experience that CVSS group has had, that we've had over these decades, is that there's always tension, there's always compromise, right? There's never a clear answer about how to do something. So for example, we've had discussions about, well, can't you just group them, UPSS guys and girls, can't you group them into high, medium, low, or very low and critical or something? And we say, well, we could, but what that requires is that we define arbitrary cutoffs, And so where do we define those cutoffs? Well, I don't know. And so that becomes subjective, and you kind of go down this rat hole of, well, nobody's really going to agree on that. It creates this artificial binning, and like it just becomes very complicated. So yes, we could. For right now, we choose not to, but there's no reason any of you in your networks couldn't define those thresholds yourselves and sort of do that. So we're not being prescriptive in any way about this, about what you can or can't do. We're just trying to provide the most objective data points that we can for you. Okay, I'm trying to go forward. Was that the last one? Okay, so I know what you're asking yourselves. You're saying, Sasha and Jay, how can I help? Well, I'm glad you asked. There are 3 ways you can help. One, try it out. Again, you can go to the page, the site, hungoffofirst.org, and download the scores right now and try it out. They're free. You get all 200,000 of them. They're yours. Do what you want with them. The second way is to, if you have any ideas of new data sources. So again, EPSS is nothing without the actual exploit data. If you know, or if you know of anyone, or you have exploit data that you collect from different sources and are interested in collaborating, and we can go through whatever data use agreements you would like, that would be wonderful. Because obviously there are limitations, right? We are limited in the inferences that we can draw and make and provide based on the sources that we collect. The data sources, these partners, are fabulous. They have hundreds of thousands of sensors scattered around the world, but they, of course, don't see the whole internet, right? So there are gaps. So we don't have good visibility on IoT. We don't have good visibility on car vulnerabilities, on medical devices, on like all kinds of other things, right? This is primarily focused on public internet type vulnerabilities. But we would like to do more. So if you have any ideas, if you know of anyone that has these kinds of data, which could come from IDS, IPS sensors, honeypots, sort of malware analysis, sort of anything and everything. And at a minimum, all we really need is the CVE ID and the date where you observed exploitation. That's it. We don't need the source, we don't need the destination, so there's no issues of attribution or identifying anything. Now, there are other opportunities for us in the analysis. If we were to collect more information, if we were to have more information about the volume, about the location of the observed attack, again, the source and the destination, but we can worry about that later. The third thing you can do, I'm not sure why these are all numbered 1, but imagine in your head they're numbered 1, 2, 3. So the third thing is to join the SIG. So the SIG is open, anyone can join, you can be part of FIRST, you can not be part of FIRST, whatever. We're happy to have you. Again, 240 odd people, we meet Fridays, every other Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern. But we just had the thought of, well, maybe we're not being terribly inclusive with that because people in Asia, Australia, India, that make up a sizable chunk of our membership are for them it's not a very convenient time. So we're trying to figure out a time that works for everyone. But anyway, you could join the calls, you could not join the calls, whatever. You could just participate. Happy to have you. And if you want to contact us, if you have any questions about any of this, then let us know.
Before we go to questions, I just want to say this is definitely the easiest talk I've ever given. So,
well,
yeah.
This is what I do for you, Jay.
Yeah.
I'm Jim Duncan from Minneapolis for a long time. I have 2 questions, sort of observations. The first one was on your, if you can bring the graph back up, where you talked about the shoulder after about 2.5 years. Yeah, that one. I guess what is between 5 years. One of the observations I wanted to make is I think there are a lot of vulnerabilities that are, it's easy for us to have the bias to assume that people are fixing vulnerabilities because we've done our job and we've told them about this flaw. But I think a vast number of vulnerabilities are fixed simply because people are doing updates without regard to the vulnerabilities that are under the hood. And back in my early days in the career, I cut my teeth on systems administration, and there was this unofficial mantra that said, never install an even-numbered release. Because bad stuff happened in an even-numbered release. And so you'd get people who would skip. And when I initially saw your graph there, I was thinking that some amount of that is the artifact of someone looking at yearly releases and skipping a release and then doing the next one and then reconciling after that. So I was just curious if you had any thoughts, if you'd worked on that or if you thought of that as an aspect of this.
So this plot right here is looking at exploitation activity, not looking at the targets or any remediation effort.
Okay.
And so this is saying, like at the 5-year mark, and you can see the percentages are small, and this is every dot is a month. And so in that 5th year, the 60th month, it's about, I'm trying to read it, 0.7, 0.8% of all exploitation activity targeted vulnerabilities in their 60th month after publication.
Okay.
So this is just looking at exploitation activity and how it spreads across new versus
at
old.
exploitation, not the success.
You're right, yeah, but that reflects, like if people are attacking things that are 5 years old more than 1 year old, that probably means that they're out there, right?
Yeah,
it's the
absolutely.
food source for the predator. And so, yeah, we're seeing, and looking at remediation data, we actually see a lot of activity up front, and we see this line, of percent open, it drops way down pretty quickly depending on what you're remediating, and then it sort of flattens out, and then it becomes very flat and long, and it never reaches zero. Right. So.
Do you still think this is the easiest talk you've ever given?
Well, I like the questions. So
second item, if I can, really quickly. The other one I was wondering about, when you talk about the age of the vulnerabilities, are you talking about the point at which the vulnerability was introduced into code, or the point at which it was published? What's your starting time on
published.
that?
Published in MITRE's CVE list, to be very explicit. Not NVD, but in MITRE's CVE list when it gets that published flag in MITRE.
So it would be, I think that's not a great idea. I think it would be really interesting to try to
There's a lot of problems with it, right?
Yeah,
Things are reserved for 20 years and a lot of things like that. And
tell us about the Blickenbacher attack.
Yeah, there's...
This stuff never going to be fixed, right?
Yeah, a lot of complexity with it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. And, the noisy data is a fact of life, and the published data is not the only thing in there. I mean, the exploit activity data is noisy, the CWE data is noisy, the CPE data is somewhat of a nightmare, so, I mean, there's a lot of fun challenges in this data. So, yes, sir.
Dude.
Actually, he's first before me.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. So one thing I was wondering, the exploitation attempt, right, or the exploitation data set, that is one of the core thing. So what has been your experience? Because to me, the better data set could have been, okay, what's actually caused breaches? Because the way I see is a lot of times Tenable, Qualys, a lot of these automated tools are always checking for vulnerabilities. They may not be actually exploiting it, right? So versus those maybe a lot of traffic you see from IDS, IPS perspective, and we are taking those things into account to look for in this model. So any thoughts around that, right? Using that data, which is the exploits which you see in the IDS, IPS versus the actual one which causes the breaches.
I didn't quite catch that. I'm sorry. There's an echo up here.
Yeah, there's a really weird
hearing
reverberation that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you restate that?
Yeah, let me repeat the question. Is it better or?
No, it's just louder. But
Okay.
try again.
Okay. So my question is the exploitive and the data set, which is your exploitation data set, which you're getting from IDS, IPS.
Yeah.
Mostly.
Most of them, right? So I was wondering, because there could be a better data set, which is very difficult to get the actual breaches. Because a lot of IDS, IPS exploitations, which you will see, is maybe Tenable, Qualys, different scanners are scanning all the time, right? And that may kind of push your data set towards the what scanners are scanning all the time, right? Common things versus the actual exploits from the bad
I get
guys.
it. Okay, so kind of. It's a terrible answer. So in theory, these IDS, IPS systems aren't being hit by internal scanners. We would probably see that come up, and we don't see like bursty things in the data. We don't see like everything getting hit at this one day, and then 7 days later get hit all again, and then 7 days later. We don't really see that in the data. But I mean, like there are non-malicious scans in here that come up, and the other thing. So Yeah, I mean, like we have to rely on the data. When people say this is being exploited, that's what we trust, and we have a hard time vetting it. But things, like honeypots and things like that, we've got some other data sources for honeypots. F5 is specifically web application, and they're actually doing packet capture and looking at strings being sent in, the requests and correlating those to vulnerabilities. So we have different ways of detecting. And IDS, IPS obviously is limited then to network things, and we're not going to see like physical or local type vulnerabilities typically. There's some endpoint software being collected too, collecting some of that exploitation activity. But yeah, I don't know if I quite answered your question, but it's like most things, it's noisy data, and we try to look for the really obvious, hey, this is a scanner, like we see this ping of all the vulnerabilities being hit. Another challenge that you didn't ask about that I'll go into is when we're trusting IPS IDS devices, we are relying on them to write signatures, and there is no device in the world that has 200,000 signatures for all of the CVEs being published. And so we've got this problem, like we've got this visibility problem. And so when we look at a vulnerability, it's in one of two states. Either it's being exploited in the wild, or we don't know if it's being exploited in the wild. We can't say for sure this is not being exploited. And so that's another challenge that we deal with when we're modeling.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hey guys, great talk, love it. In particular, I like this graph, and I wanted to ask a question going off the first question and the remarks you were making at the end. It would be really wonderful to see this also broken out by some aspect of your constituencies, like the size of the organization or the geography or the industry vertical, something like that. Because I'm sure, at least this is my theory, I'd love to be proven wrong. I bet this graph looks really different for a big cloud provider versus an SMB. And I'd love to know the difference in that curve. I think that could be really instructive. I'm curious, I'm sure you've already had a conversation like this already. Yeah,
that would be awesome. That'd be cool. We don't have it. And like a lot of the devices like Fortinet this is Fortinet's deployed worldwide deployment of their devices. And so they actually don't report who the company is, and even not who, but like what industry, what size, no idea. All we know is that there's a device that triggered on this particular vulnerability. And that's all we know. And so we can't actually divide this up by sector, size, revenue, any of that. So we're sort of stuck here, but I'd love to see it too.
I kind of figured that was the case. Thank you.
Yeah.
What we can do, and what Jay will show you at the workshop tomorrow, is this broken out by type of vulnerability. So was it published on Metasploit or Exploit DB? Was it a Microsoft vulnerability versus an Oracle or whatever? And that gets super interesting.
Yeah.
So this isn't to say that we couldn't do the work. I mean, technically it's possible. We just don't have the information. But perhaps over time, and there are lots of other properties. So again, currently we're only producing information, providing information about will this vulnerability be exploited in the next 30 days, yes or no. We don't provide any insight into how much or say that the frequency or the prevalence or the whatever other characteristics of exploitation, right? Again, because of data limitations. Hopefully we will later on.
And I think we're running short on time, but go ahead.
So my question's partially answered with the fact that you guys don't collect industry data. But as an aside, do you think if people were to tag CVEs based on device type or device that they would impact, you could kind of create a graph as to who is most likely to be targeted in the next 30 days based on that information? My thought directly goes to healthcare, and I know the limitations of it in terms of security because I work there, but maybe there's something like a mailing list where if you were able to tag certain CVEs with data, people could register to a mailing list. You could inform them within a 30-day time frame of, hey, this is possibly going to happen at your organization, look out for it. Thank you.
Yeah, and so we're not getting industry from any of this, but what we do have is like device information and the CPE data that NVD publishes, and so we can see things like Siemens devices, or if there's a Boston Scientific device or something that's specifically in healthcare, we could look at the rate of exploitation for that target, but not necessarily for everything in healthcare industry or anything like that. But we can look by the vendor and the product information. So.
We're being pulled off stage. Jay and I will be around for the next couple of days. Feel free to snag us in the hall and ask any questions. Thank you all very much.
Thanks.